This tutorial is going to show you how you can work with third-party virtual machine images within VIRL. We're going to first examine this concept of something called a subtype. So I'm logging into the user workspace management and I'm logging in as UWM admin, and our default password is password. And when we look over on the left-hand side there, we can see this panel entry called subtype. So that's what we're going to take a look at now. Okay, so what is a subtype? Well, this is a set of parameters which we then associate with a virtual machine image. And you can see a whole series that we've created. These are a set of defaults that are there for you to use and are used by the system itself when you're using it on a day-to-day basis. So for example, if we take a look at the IOSV type, we look down the list of entries here, we can see things such as the name of the management Ethernet interface, the name of the data interfaces, the number of data interfaces, and various other elements such as how is the configuration file presented to it. So here we can see it's presented as a disk and it has a particular name. So when the IOSV instance boots up, it's looking for that particular name. We can see other entries such as the virtual machine, the virtual interface model, so E1000. Now we can modify these settings using this function known as specialize. So effectively this creates a clone based on our underlying settings. So here we can see that. We should actually give this a new name, otherwise it's going to complain. So we're going to give this something, so we're going to call it example. And then we can make the various modifications. So for example, if the Ethernet interfaces were not starting at 0, let's say it starts at slot 1, we can go in and make that modification. Similarly with the name itself, it could be changed. It could be Ethernet, it could be serial, whatever the name is that's required. So here we can see various other settings that we can modify. We can also say, okay, well, how is that configuration file presented? Is it, CD-ROM? Is it cloud init? And note the difference between CD-ROM and ISO 9660. Some virtual machines are very specific about how that configuration file has to be presented. So the name here is what we're going to write to the disk. So in this case, a CD-ROM that we're going to present to that virtual machine. So we can see we've got a number of different VIF models, virtual interface models. Normally we see E1000 or VirtIO, but you have to check, right? Each virtual machine image is very specific as to what interfaces it supports. We can also set the amount of memory and the number of CPUs, but there is an interesting function here, and we'll come back and look at that in a moment. So here we are then creating our subtype. So we've now created a subtype called IOSV example. Now this is just a set of parameters. There is no virtual machine disk image that's a counterpart to that at this point in time. So then we can do a series of things. We can modify, and we can delete. So next we're going to press the add button and just go through the process as if we were adding an image. So now when we drop that subtype menu, there we can see IOSV example is now listed as an option. So we're now using this menu system able to bind a virtual machine image to that subtype. So you then have the subtype and the virtual machine image operating as a pair. Okay, so now we're going to go through the process of adding a third-party image. So in this case, I'm picking up a Fedora 21 image. Now Fedora themselves offer an OpenStack image. So this is a Linux server image which includes cloud init. Okay, so this allows us to pass in configuration in the form using cloud init, which allows us then to configure that virtual machine as we boot. So this is based on a server type, and we already have that base configuration as a subtype that we can use. So I'm going to specialize that server subtype. There we are. And now we're using the menu here to make various changes. Okay, so the Ethernet name is the same, so we don't need to change anything there. Same with the first data interface. So nothing here that we particularly need to modify. We can choose to enable VNC or not, so we'll leave that on because we'll show that working. And obviously we want to show the icon in the palette. Now we're using cloud init, so that whole series of options there we're going to leave alone. But here I've got my option. I'm setting E1000 as my network device driver. Okay, now we're looking at the amount of memory here. Now there are a couple of options, as I mentioned earlier, that we can do here. So I could set a hard number like so, and this performs our base. So we can say 3192 and 2 vCPUs. But notice we've also got this option towards the bottom, the default flavor. So I'm just going to set these back, and then we'll take a look at what these flavor things are. So there are names that you may have seen, things like M1 medium or M1 large, and I can set this as a base level against which the virtual machine is going to boot up, and it's going to use these parameters. So if we set this to M1 medium, and then we press create, what are we actually creating here? Well, let's take a look at the flavors options. So here we see M1 medium set with 4 gigs of memory, 2 vCPUs, and a disk of 40 gigs. So that's going to be our base set of parameters that we're going to present to the virtual machine as it boots. So we've set M1 medium, that's what's going to be applied. So the next thing is now to bind our virtual machine image to our subtype. By leaving the name version field blank, we can still put a value in the release field, but by leaving that blank, this then sets it as the default image. We're then passing the parameters to where it can find the disk. I'm uploading from my desktop here, and then we press create. And that's now loading the virtual machine image into VIRL's glance database. And there we can see the parameters that get returned as that virtual machine image is now loaded. So the next thing we're going to do is now set up our VIRL Maestro to now use that new image. So we're going to go to File, Preferences, and look for the Subtype option. We're going to use this function called Fetch from Server. So when we fetch, it's now seeing the new Fedora server entry. We can see it there. We can see it set to true. There's an icon associated with it and those parameter settings. So if we apply, that icon will now appear under the nodes palette there on the left-hand side. So there we can see it. We also see there the IOSV example subtype that we created earlier alongside our Fedora server. So we want to clean that up. So if we go back into UWM admin and we look under subtypes, you can see there it is, IOSV example, and we're just going to delete that. I'm now going to go back to VIRL Maestro and restore the defaults and then fetch from server again. And now we see that the IOSV example has gone. Our Fedora server is still there, so that's what we want to have. We just press apply and we're okay. And now we're going to set up a little topology there. So we've got one server, so we're going to have Ubuntu on the one. And they're going to drop in a Fedora server on the other. And we're just going to wire these two together very quickly. Now, since VIRL supports configuration through Cloud Init, we can use the build initial configurations function, there it is, to set up the configuration for the Fedora server. Now, obviously, if you've got another virtual machine type with a particular configuration syntax that the initial configuration function AutoNetKit does not support, then we can't create the configuration for it. So what you can still do is to use the configuration tab there to pass in a configuration. So this is just a text file. This is editable. So here we can see an example which has been generated for Cloud Init. But just imagine this is another syntax type. As long as you've got that syntax, you know what the appropriate configuration is that can be passed in, you can copy and paste that into this field. It will be presented to the virtual machine, and assuming the virtual machine has been set up correctly and looking in the right place, it should then read it in. Now here, just to show you, we can make additional configuration changes. So here you can see you've got an ifconfig. I could put additional commands in here. Could ask it to run netstat or add a root entry. Whatever it is that I want to do. Obviously, there's no syntax checking that's going on here. It is just a case of passing in the appropriately formatted command that the virtual machine should then interpret and execute when that virtual machine is then run. Okay, so now we're going to start up our topology with our Ubuntu and our Fedora server. So we can watch those virtual machines coming up now. And as soon as that goes active, we can then open up the serial port connection and watch the system going through. So what we're seeing here is Cloud Init taking place because that's the configuration system that the Fedora image supports. And we can also connect on to the VNC console of this particular device because that's what we've also enabled. So here we've got our VNC. And because Cloud Init has run, it's created our account for us. So the username Cisco and password Cisco, so we can log in. Now, depending on the virtual machine image that you're using, obviously you might need to use other usernames and passwords. Obviously you'll need to figure that out. Okay, but once we're in, there we can see that because Cloud Init is run, both ETH0 and ETH1 have come up, and we can see IP addresses have been injected. And there's also a loopback interface that's up there. So if we now connect on to the Ubuntu server that we've got connected on the other side, there we go. And again, we're logging in over there. We can check our IP address on our interface. So that's on our out-of-band management network. And we can see that this host is .1. So if we ping across, there we can see we've got reachability. So that's from Ubuntu to Fedora. And then we can also SSH in, again, going this is out of band again. And again, we're able to log in, as you'd expect. Just going to confirm connectivity in band. So there we're looking at the IP address at the far end. So that's the 0.6 IP address. And that's on our ETH1 interface. So we can see directly connected on that subnet via the unmanaged switch instance. So we're going to ping the .6, and then we can see we've got return. So that's good. And now SSH again over the in-band connection. And now we're able to see we can log in. Go up to the Fedora instance, issue a trace path coming back the other way, and there we can see the return. So you'll recall that we set a flavor setting the amount of memory and the number of CPUs that are associated with that virtual machine. So here we can use the command top to see the amount of memory, and there we can see we've got 4 gigs assigned to the machine. And if we press the number 1, we can now see we've got 2 CPUs associated, just as we had specified in the flavor. So if we stop that command, and we now issue the command df, just to take a look at the disk. There we go. And we can see that we'd specified a 40 gig disk, and there we can see it. So that's been associated with that virtual machine